Recently, I did a video on the top 10 strongest Pokemon from Gen 1, so it only makes sense that I follow it up with the top 10 strongest from Gen 2. Like the Gen 1 list, this is mostly from a competitive point of view, and anything in the Uber tier is banned from making it into this list. So that means no Mewtwo, Mew, Celebi, Ho-Oh, and Lugia. The nuances of Gen 2's mechanics already make it feel pretty different from Generation 1 competitive, and overall, the roster feels a little bit more balanced. However, roster balance isn't everything, and a lot of impressions from fans aren't always accurate. Gen 1 is often mocked for how all over the place it is compared to other generations in terms of balance. You can't go 2 seconds without someone mentioning how the Psychic typing is clearly the best. It's true that Psychic is the best typing in Gen 1, but if you look back at my list for the best Gen 1 Pokemon, the top 3 were all normal types, not Psychic. And that's a very common take among Generation 1 competitive players, not just me. This brings us to Gen 2. Now, if you guys have been around my content enough, then you know I love me some Gen 2. But there's also no denying that Gen 2 competitive is more of an acquired taste than any other generation. And yes, even more than Gen 1. Everything feels bulkier, there's a lot of switching, and there's the introduction of Steel and Dark types, as well as the move Spikes. Held items were also introduced, and nearly every Pokemon uses leftovers. Basically, the meta here demands a little more mental fortitude and patience than usual. Before we begin though, I create exclusive content over on Mystic Umbreon Shorts every day with Pokemon facts, and 2 exclusive series on the weekend. I also read anime fanfics over on Mystic Reads. Right now, I'm reading Road to be a Pokemon Master. I'm also streaming again, over on my channel, Mystigarion. I will leave all these channels in the description below. With that said, let's begin now. Deciding who would make number 10 was pretty brutal, even more than the last list, because there are a few Pokemon that feel too iconic in Gen 2 overuse to leave out. But such is the nature of these lists. Here we have Steelix, probably one of the most iconic evolutions introduced in the game. With that 200 base defense stat, it goes without saying this is an excellent counter to physical attackers, and there are enough of them for Steelix to fit into the meta pretty well. The Steel typing also speaks for itself as well, as it usually does. Its ground typing isn't always a gift, though it does give its Earthquake the stab bonus it needs to make up for its mere 85 base attack stat. Steelix's secondary offensive move options aren't great, however. Body Slam seems like the basic choice, but I also like Explosion, which was buffed in power going into Gen 2. Curse is also a common choice to boost its satisfying attack power, along with Roar, in order to prevent the opponent from countering effectively, and annoy them with Spikes damage if another Pokemon on the team left them behind. Still, Steelix is not perfect defensively. Its lack of bulk and special defense sticks out if it takes any damage from water and fire types. But with the right game plan, these issues can be mitigated, and it's the reason Steelix makes it into our top 10. Years ago, the idea of this Pokemon being above Steelix would have been mocked by the Gen 2 competitive community. But as time has gone on and the meta has continued to develop, Golem has earned our respect. The story of Golem in competitive is interesting up to this point, as it had a strong start in Gen 1, but was eventually totally overshadowed by Rhydon in the late 2010s. I still think it's decent in Gen 1, but it's clear that Rhydon has become the favorite, and Golem's recent fall from grace in competitive Gen 1 has already become a pretty well documented legend. This was the opposite for Gen 2 competitive, where it wasn't seen as anything too special, but eventually people started to realize that having Explosion, Roar, and Rapid Spin on one Pokemon that could resist powerful normal type attacks was kind of a huge deal. And remember, all normal type attacks are physical until Generation 4. And with 110 base attack, it gets to enjoy a superior Earthquake in comparison to its fellow physical tank, Steelix. You could also run a Curse set, but you're kind of missing out on that perfect trio of utility a tough Pokemon like Golem gets to have. Being able to remove Spikes of Rapid Spin can cause serious headaches for the opponent in Gen 2. Its main issues are of course water types, and pretty much anything that doesn't care about getting hit by Earthquake. You can run a second attack, usually a fire attack for coverage, but Roar, Explosion, and Rapid Spin have proven to be so excellent on Golem that I think it's worth sticking with this powerful niche along with Earthquake as your primary attack. Ultimately though, certain things about Golem are still a bit more niche compared to other entries on this list, but it hasn't changed the fact that the usage of this Pokemon in Generation 2 competitive has gone way up in recent years. At number 8, we have another iconic Steel type, Skarmory. This guy has been here as one of the top tiers in competitive Gen 2 since basically the release of Gold and Silver. And remember when I said sometimes Golem will sometimes try to fit in a fire attack for coverage? Well, here's a good example as to why, since Skarmory is an often used Steel type that doesn't care about Earthquake, an extremely common powerful move. Skarmory is yet another tanky Pokemon with 140 physical defense that acts as a physical wall. You're seeing an unsurprising trend here. You're also seeing a trend with the movesets here, with Whirlwind and Curse often being used with Skarmory. If you count Whirlwind and Roar as basically being the same move, then with Curse, those two moves in Gen 2 are kind of like the equivalent of how Blizzard and Body Slam were everywhere in Gen 1 competitive. Drill Peck and Rest are the other two bread and butter moves for Skarmory, though I can see someone going with something other than Curse with their Skarmory, like Toxic. It's actually impressive that Skarmory manages to be so good with a pretty mediocre 465 overall base stat total, but the typing, moveset, and stat distribution really put it up high here. Since so many of its base stats go into defense, that means its special defense isn't great, and its bulk is even worse. So ultimately, it has a similar problem to our previous entries. Just keep our Steel bird friend away from fire and electric, and you'll get results. And here we have yet another Pokemon that excels with its resistances against normal attacks, Tyranitar. Unlike Skarmory, Tyranitar fits comfortably in the 600 club, as far as its base stat total goes, and you don't need to think too hard to figure out why it's good. It's a very common Pokemon in Gen 2 competitive for this reason, and it's a very easy rock type to immediately look at and want to fit into your team. That, and maybe because it looks cool. Its main flaw is that it doesn't really excel as much offensively as you think it would due to not having a super strong stab attack. Though that 134 base attack is still nuts. Rock Slide is your go-to rock move, but Dark is trickier. You'll have to choose between Pursuit or Crunch. Crunch may seem like the obvious choice, but this generation has so many switch-ins that Pursuit is better than you think it is. Some players may actually run both of these attacks together. So you do have that option, but you'll have to sacrifice a move slot that could have ended up being Earthquake or something. You can also do your run-of-the-mill Curse set to boost your offense further, but ultimately, you're gonna be stuck with a move like Rock Slide or something. And of course, Roar is once again pretty universal here to attempt to control your opponent. That's just how high-level Gen 2 play is, for better or worse. But T-Tar is overall very simple to use here. Its checks and counters are what you expect due to its typing, and it's a big, bulky, tough guy with great stats all around, minus its speed. And you know what? Tyranitar gets even better in Gen 3. Next, we have a Pokemon making its second consecutive appearance on these lists, Exeggutor. Despite the pacing changes in Gen 1 versus Gen 2 competitive, Exeggutor is here for almost the exact same reasons as before, so I won't waste your time repeating myself too much. You can even run the Gen 2 version of the same moveset and get excellent results like before, with Sleep Powder, Giga Drain, Psychic, and Explosion. Giga Drain being just a better version of Mega Drain, and the buff to Explosion means this moveset is just straight up better in terms of numbers this time around. The special stat split, however, resulted in a huge nerf to its special defense, unfortunately, but it still fares pretty well regardless with its nice bulk. If it gets Spike support, it can also run a new and quite frankly annoying Leech Seed setup alongside that Spike damage. Exeggutor gets checked really hard by Skarmory, however, resulting in Hidden Power Fire being a common coverage move. And having no access to Roar or Whirlwind does feel a little strange when dealing with its counters. But its moveset and bulk is still strong enough to make even some of its counters think twice about how to deal with our Coconut Boy. Starting off our top 5 is Gengar, who was in the honorable mentions of our Gen 1 video. Ghost types are still not in their prime yet as of Gen 2, despite having Shadow Ball. For whatever reason, all Ghost type attacks were made to be physical instead of special, until the move splits in Generation 4 of course. This means that on Gengar, Shadow Ball isn't really that great, and isn't often used, since Gengar only has 65 attack. That doesn't stop it from being incredible in Gen 2 however, since its move pull options are insane, and it still gets to pop off with that 135 special attack and 110 speed. The standard set that's allowed Gengar to remain dominant is typically Thunderbolt, Ice Punch, Hypnosis, and Explosion. Destiny Bond is sometimes used in Explosion's place in some sets. You can also run a set with Mean Look and Paris Song, but I don't think I'd often use it over the standard set unless you're really confident you're going to catch someone off guard with it, since usually that strategy is used with Misdreavus instead. Gengar's biggest problem is its fertility, as it has poor bulk, and the special split really hurt its special defense, just like with their previous entry. There are definitely some things Misdreavus is better at as a ghost type due to not sharing the poison typing, but Gengar gets to be immune to Toxic, which can be a serious problem in the Gen 2 meta. Gengar is also just really strong in general, being able to just go in with electric and ice coverage with such a high special attack, and the ability to sleep and threaten with explosion has been enough to terrorize even the best of Gen 2 teams. The only Johto legendary in our top 10 makes it here at number 4, Raikou. Like our Gen 1 list, it's the electric typing of the Generations trio that's the best. Its 580 base stat total allows it to have 115 special attack and speed, and pretty acceptable numbers spread out for everything else. Its main problem is exactly what you think it is, Earthquake, and its worst stat happens to be its physical defense. So yeah, physical threats in general are an issue with this Pokemon. You can alleviate this against a Pokemon like Golem a little bit with Hidden Power Water, but your coverage options are a little limited. You'll notice that Raikou is a very simple combatant compared to the rest of the list. You give it Thunderbolt, coverage of some kind, Rest, and Roar. Boom, there you go. There's also a Rest and Sleep Talk option that can work if you're willing to drop Roar. But that's about it as far as its most well-known options go. But just that basic strategy for Raikou is so powerful that it makes the top 5 pretty easily. There are a lot of Pokemon that would be more common in competitive Generation 2, but aren't because of how this Thunder Beast counters them and keeps them away. And now we have another entry from our top 10 Gen 1 list. And if you're not familiar with Gen 2 competitive, then it's one you're probably not expecting, Cloyster. But it's actually a very common choice in high-level play. Seriously, go look up some Gold Silver Crystal matches, and Cloyster is almost as common as the 2 Pokemon that will place ahead of it on our list. And why is that? Spikes. Spikes and 180 base defense. It's not the best spike setter in literally every situation, but it is the best one overall. It also has access to Rapid Spin for extra utility, but some may prefer the threat of Explosion instead. Adding Surf and Toxic to Cloyster's moveset is usually the play, or the usual hidden power coverage. But Spikes is obviously the must-have here. On its own, Cloyster is good, but Spikes makes the entire team better, and is a tremendous move in Gen 2's meta. It's incredible on almost every single team composition, and there really aren't that many spike setters in Gold and Silver. The only other viable spike setter in Overused is Forretress, who is actually another great Pokemon. It's just a bit slower and has a weaker attack stat compared to Cloyster, but it's still a good choice depending on how you set up your team too. Of course, Cloyster also checks a bunch of the game's previously mentioned powerful rock and ground types of Surf. Cloyster is almost always a must-have if you're trying to put together the best team. Yet another returning Pokemon from our Gen 1 list, it's Zapdos. Once again, I won't waste your time too much, as not only is it good based on its incredible speed and special attack, but unlike Raikou, it doesn't have to worry about Earthquake. It also isn't totally useless against rock types like it was in Gen 1, where it could only use Drill Peck to attack them. Now, it can use Hidden Power Water or Ice. On top of that, it can also use Whirlwind to force swaps as well. The new moveset options alone basically guaranteed that Zapdos would be even better in Gen 2 than it was in Gen 1, where it was already great. It's almost the same concept as Raikou, just with a few different vulnerabilities and a major immunity to Earthquake. And before we move to number 1, it's time for Gen 2's honorable mentions. Forretress. We talked about this one during Cloyster's entry. One of the only 2 viable spike setters in OU, which automatically makes it great. Venusaur and Meganium. Both are respectable grass types, and Meganium is the strongest of the Johto starters in Gen 2 competitive. I also think Meganium is slightly better than Venusaur here due to it just being a pure grass type, but they're almost equal. Charizard, which begins its belly drum era here in Gen 2. Its best friend is Cloyster, not only because of spikes, but because it can annoy many of Charizard's counters. Starmie. Still a very powerful choice for similar reasons to Gen 1. Only now, it's also an excellent rapid spinner too. Nidoking. Generally more famous in Gen 1 for in-game playthroughs, but wasn't exactly revered in competitive. Here in Gen 2, it's actually amazing in competitive as a mixed attacker. This was the most painful Pokemon to leave out of the top 10. It would basically be my number 11 pick. Suicune. One of the best water type tanks in the game. It does have a lot of counters however. Entei, who can scare some of its own water threats with an instant solar beam while Sunny Day is up and has overall solid stats. Ironically, one of its counters is fellow fire type Charizard, who isn't going to be scared of Entei's movesets and will just fight back with Earthquake. Umbreon. One of the first Pokemon people may think of when it comes to how good defensive walls can be in Gen 2. It's also a great baton passer if you choose to run it with Mean Look. Other honorable mentions include Misdreavus, Marowak, Vaporeon, Heracross, Jinx, Smeargle, Machamp, Blissey, Espeon, Miltank, Rhydon, Alakazam, and Tentacruel. And in our number 1 spot, by far and away head and shoulders above every Pokemon in Overused, is Snorlax. If you played Gen 2 competitive, you knew this was coming. Just like Tauros being at the top of the Gen 1 list. And even then, I did say that Snorlax got even better in Gen 2 when I listed it in that video. And it's true, Snorlax is ridiculous. If you broke up this list by lettered tiers, Zapdos would be A tier and Snorlax would be triple S tier or something. That's how ahead he is of everyone else in Overused. It's not shocking that such a bulky Pokemon would excel in Gen 2 competitive, but it's really insane here. The new moves introduced in Gen 2 synergize so well with what makes Snorlax great already, and takes it to never before seen proportions. The most common is to give it Curse and run with a heavy-hitting normal attack, coverage, and rest. But if that's a little too basic for you, then there's Rest and Sleep Talk sets, where you can freely go to town with Double Edge. Still not fun enough for you? Well, Snorlax can use Belly Drum to maximize its attack ASAP, and prepare to Thanos snap the entire opposing team out of existence. It's already so bulky that it'll still take a while to kill even without a defense boost. This is probably the least popular set of the 3 I've mentioned, but they're all incredibly scary to deal with regardless. Another reason why it's so dominant is the lack of real counters. There are plenty of strategies for each Pokemon that try to give Snorlax some problems, but the only consistent check for Snorlax is probably Skarmory. It's Steel typing and high physical defense, and it's immune to Earthquake, a commonly chosen coverage move. However, Snorlax has tons of coverage options. So it could just choose Thunder or Fire Blast as coverage instead to scare it and take advantage of its low bulk and special defense. I could start listing off what other Pokemon have to offer to try to mitigate this monstrosity, but ultimately, these checks are put under a different standard from other Pokemon. They're there to slow Snorlax down in a group effort. Even in the earliest days of Gold and Silver, before major resources existed to help players understand the metagame, people had to acknowledge how ridiculous Snorlax was. Kids during lunch hour would rant angrily about how, of all things, it's this lazy, sleepy, fat Pokemon that would destroy their entire Gold and Silver team whenever they battled their friends.
Been in this business 15, 20 years, and this fat son of a bitch is gonna try us all out!
Calm down, okay? Alright?
He's fat!
But make no mistake, in the Gen 2 overused meta, it's Snorlax's world, and we're all just living in it. And those are my picks for the top 10 strongest Pokemon in Gen 2. It's a very different generation when it comes to competitive, and while it's not for everyone, I think like Gen 1, it should be appreciated and respected for what it is. But how do you feel about this list? Were you surprised by the top 10? What does your list and competitive Gen 2 team look like? Let me know down below. We're finally here in 2023, and I'm super excited for what this year has to offer us. There's potential DLC for Scarlet and Violet on the horizon, and who knows just what else Game Freak may have up their sleeves. It's gonna be really exciting times coming up for a Pokemon fan. If you're interested in more Mystic content, check out my TikTok and Mystic Umbreon Shorts YouTube channel. I've got a really fun series starting up there very soon, and of course, have a weekly edition of my Should You Use series focusing on Pokemon in Scarlet and Violet. Also, if you're into fanfictions and what ifs, check out Mystic Reads. I offer a ton of creative spoken word content on there, so come join me. Thanks again for joining me today, and I'll see you all next time.